Okay, we're on. Okay, my name is Bill Thayer. I am making this short video vignette of a talk that I've given on a cruise ship. This is a little vignette just on Captain Cook, just to give you an idea of the type of enrichment talks I've done. This is in the exploration area. I've done other vignettes that are on aviation and technology. So I just want to illustrate that I've got a little more broader background than that. So the way we're going to do this again is this is going to be to kind of show you who I am here, and I realize that with the screen is going to look pretty blank. We don't have a good enough camera to do both me and the screen. So about a third of the way through, we're going to do a little switch and move the ladder up here. My wife, who's the camera person or the grip, is going to reposition the ladder, and then we're going to focus just on the screen for the last 2/3 of the presentation because I got more charts that are interesting on that. And at that point in time, I'll just sort of pan around this room, which is we call our library, which I've got a lot of books in, but I've got books in 2 other rooms and one wall of the garage. So I got 8,000 hard copy books, and my wife is happy that I'm now starting on 2,000 books in the cloud because it doesn't clutter anything up. So we're also going to prove that Hollywood has nothing to worry about from the Thayer film production area. You can see that with the quality of this picture. So Captain Cook, Antarctica, he did 3 voyages. What I talked about, what's going to be the vignette on this one, is the one that he did to Antarctica. Now the first voyage he went down after doing the transit of Venus at Tahiti. He went down and he mapped Australia and New Zealand. Then what the Royal Navy and the Geographic Society wanted is to see if there was any other continent further south. So they sent him to go as far south as he could go, further than any man went before, and he made a spectacular circumnavigation over a 3-year period around Antarctica, and that's kind of the subject of this talk. This was again on happened to be given on a around the world cruise, just a segment from Hong Kong to Dubai. That's where I was giving these talks, and it was one of 10 talks because we had 10 sea days. Now, one thing that I want to, that I didn't mention before, but I do want to give you an idea. I give talks on cruise ships, but I also talk to the passengers on the cruise ship, and they're fascinating people. Some people come up to me after I've given a talk, some people I meet at dinner, some people I just meet around the ship, but it's all fascinating. I want to just give you some idea of some of the people I've met that are kind of interesting, and a lot of interesting people. I gave this talk on Captain Cook. Actually, it was the 3rd talk on Captain Cook, where he's trying for the Northwest Passage through the Bering Strait. And of course, he was killed in Hawaii, and the person that took over was Captain Clerk. That was the 2nd ship that was sailing with Cook at the time. And Captain Clerk, just to give you an idea how dedicated these people were to Cook, Captain Clerk was diagnosed as they were first coming out of England down in Cape Town, South Africa. He was diagnosed with terminal tuberculosis. So anybody else probably would have gotten on a ship and gone back to England from Cape Town. There were plenty of ships. He had plenty of opportunities to do that. He did. He knew he was going to die. He'd rather die sailing with Cook. So when Cook was killed in Hawaii, Clerk took over. Now he was in very ill health, but he nevertheless made a valiant attempt to go through the Northwest Passage through the Bering Strait again. Again, he wasn't able to do it because of the pack ice. And he came down, and the first place they were going to make landfall was Petropavlovsk. This is on the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. And he died shortly before they made landfall. And he was buried in Petropavlovsk. And I mentioned that in my talk. Well, I saw one guy was particularly interested in the talk, and he came up afterwards and he said, I went to Petropavlovsk. Now, I've not been to Petropavlovsk myself. He says, I went to Petropavlovsk, and there was a statue to this English guy, and I took a bunch of pictures. I never knew what the statue was for. Now I know what it's for. And that's kind of what I'm aiming for in all my talks. We've got some well-traveled, very knowledgeable people, but if I can add some information that they didn't have before, that's a mission success story. So that was Petropavlovsk. Now, I was giving another one. This was not a talk, but it was a commentary that we have an Explorer Lounge on the 7th floor. We look out, and you got a great view. We were coming out of St. Petersburg to Kronstadt Island, and I was given the talk about how Peter the Great established his navy there, and how the sailors played a role in the Russian Revolution, which I gave a talk on, and then how the sailors later rebelled against Lenin and Trotsky because they were being too arbitrary, and they wanted things like free elections and secret ballot and stuff like that. So Trotsky sent out his troops, was unsuccessful in subduing them the first time, but sent out 3 times as many troops the second time, killed about 1,000 sailors and captured 2,000. The other 7,000 managed to escape over the ice because it was all frozen over during the winter to the North Shore, so they escaped. But the 2,000 that were captured, there wasn't even a sham trial. They just plain executed them. So while I'm giving this talk, again, somebody is just looking at me intently, and I'm going, gosh, maybe I'm going into too much detail. Well, he came up to me afterwards and he said, my grandfather was one of the 2,000 that was executed. So here I am. I mean, this is just an interesting story. So here I am talking about history, but his family actually lived through, or in this particular case, died in this part of history. But just fascinating stories that people have. One of my favorite ones is down in Australia and New Zealand. I'm talking about how Auckland, they have their Maritime Museum, and I was looking for a whole bunch of information on Captain Cook, and what it was more about was about the New Zealanders winning the America's Cup. And I saw a guy afterwards, and he says, well, I had the America's Cup on my dining room table, and I go, no way. You know, and it turned out he was an RAF pilot, flew Vulcans, moved to Australia, flew for ANZ Airlines, lived in Perth, Australia, was retired, and he made furniture, and he made the trophy case for the America's Cup when the Australians first won it in the 1980s. So sure enough, he gave me a picture which I can use in some of my talks, and there it is, the America's Cup, his wife and his daughter, and the America's Cup sitting on his dining room table. What a story. Oh, just another RAF guy. This is a guy I met shortly after Desert Storm. He was a high-ranking RAF officer at the time. It's a long story. But later he became the Air Chief Marshal. That means you're the head of the RAF. He showed up on my cruise to Russia. So I gave a talk later. We went to Berlin, or Warnemünde actually. And I gave a talk in Berlin. The airlift came up and said, oh, it's me. You know, and that was great. That was a reunion after 27 years. But to, you know, not just pilots and stuff like that, I meet people that I know nothing about what they do. For example, I met Steve on one of my last cruises. He is a producer and a director of plays. I know absolutely nothing about that. So he happened to be single. My wife was with me on that trip. We had dinner together, and he told me all about that. Really fascinating. I learned all this stuff about how you do plays, how you do the research, you look at all the different scripts, et cetera, et cetera. So doctors, lawyers, engineers, farmers, nurses, a pianist. Okay, everybody's got a story, and it's really interesting. So I just wanted to take a little step down into describing some of the interesting people that I meet on a cruise. I really look forward to it. It's one of the treats of being on a cruise. You really meet fascinating people. Well, back to Cook, finally. On this particular talk, what I do in all my talks, I give 3 on Captain Cook, but I'm never sure if everybody's going to show up for all the talks. So I give a little general background on how he started out sailing coal ships down from Newcastle to London. Then he played a key part in the battle for Quebec. He actually did the soundings for the ships that went in where the British went up the secret path of planes to Abraham. That's a long story. And then what he did in this talk, he did 3 sweeps, and I will go into those a little bit later. 3 sweeps over a 3-year period. He would go down, then he'd come back to someplace like New Zealand or Tahiti and rest, and then go down again when it was the good time of sailing down there. This is a picture of Captain Cook. That might be coming through. And as I said, I did a summary on his previous what he did prior to this. This was his second voyage of exploration. Well, what he did first is he headed for around the Cape Horn of Africa to New Zealand, went into New Zealand, and then he headed south. Now on these ships they provision themselves with a lot of food, and that includes having some animals like pigs or chickens or something like that on board. Well, he's heading south. It gets really cold. The animals all die. So they eat well for a while, but they don't have any food for the future. And down there, the sailing is very, very difficult. If you've ever been in the South Seas, you know it's very, very, I mean, South Seas, I'm talking about getting close to the Antarctic region. The 40s are known as the roaring 40s because it's so windy. The 50s, this is between 50 and 60 degrees latitude. That's the screaming 50s, and the 60s, if you ever get down to the 60s, it's the shrieking 60s. This gives you some idea of the wind conditions that you can run into down there. Well, what he did on his first sweep down there is he went down to 67 degrees south. Now, Antarctic Circle is 66 degrees south. So he was the first person past the Antarctic Circle. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reposition here with the expert assistance of my wife. You might want to close your eyes. I'm going to sort of pan the room for some books, and then I'm going to focus in on some books to give you an idea of one source of my information is my books, of course, but I go to museums, I travel. I've been 3 times around the world, over 60 countries, met a lot of people. I get information from a lot of people. So that's where I get my information. So we will try the transition. Okay. I realize it's pretty shaky, but this kind of gives you an idea of the wall of books in this particular room. And then I want to come up close to some of those. Oh yeah, that's our dog. So here, what we have, this top shelf, this is History of Civilization by the Durants. Okay, so I've read all those books. But probably the first ones that I read a long time ago is this. These are the Cambridge History of the World right here. So there's a whole bunch of volumes there. And then I just want to show you these over here. These are like about 15 volumes by Samuel Eliot Morison, who's a fantastic author. This is on the Navy in World War II. Not relevant to Cook, but just to give you some idea of this stuff. And then some of my books that are favorite books as far as exploration. The ship, this talks about various different types of ship. And this is seamanship. This is on square riggers. A lot of people regard this as the Bible of square riggers. This is Voyages Around the World by Fanning. He went down to South Georgia Island. That is way south in 1792, an American. These were sealers, and this led to later to Palmer, who was a sealer, probably being the first person to step foot in Antarctica, was part of this sealing operation. And then just a couple books by Samuel Eliot Morison. These are Discovery of the Northern Voyages and the Southern Voyages. So close your eyes again. And we're going to try to focus on there's our ladder. Trying to focus on the screen. And I'll let my wife position that. Whoops. Okay, so now you're going to see the screen in my hand. Hopefully you got enough of looking at me. So on this talk, what I want to do is I want to orient people as to what Antarctica looks like and where the different latitudes are. So if we're talking 50 degrees, we're talking this circle of latitude. 60 down here, nobody went below 60 before Cook. And then 70, which is right down here, really close to Antarctica. So this is the part that sticks out the furthest, the peninsula. So what Cook did, this is his first voyage, the red line around the world. And the second voyage, what he did is he came down here and he did a sweep down here past Antarctica, came up to New Zealand. And what it kind of looked like from the New Zealand point of view is coming down here. He came very, very close. Couldn't get further south than this because of the ice conditions. But he was 67 degrees south latitude. That would have, if he had been over here, he would have hit the peninsula. But he happened to be on the other side of Antarctica, so he didn't. But 67 degrees south. And then they ran into very, very bad weather conditions. And the two ships, it was Adventure along with his ship, and the Adventure split and went out here and went to harbor at Hobart in Tasmania. He went over here to Queen Charlotte Sound in New Zealand. That was his favorite place. These orange arrows just show some of the earlier people that went further south than the French. This is out at 50 degrees. It's Kerguelen Island. This is Magellan, 1519, Drake, 1598, just some of the people that down there. I go through all that in detail. And this just gives you an idea of the two ships that when they were sailing together before they got separated by fog. And what they have to watch out for, of course, are icebergs. So here's an iceberg. This happens to be, this is happens to be, pardon me, happens to be when I was a passenger on the Celebrity Infinity, and we were down going to Antarctica, Paradise Bay, but it shows a seal sort of taking a nap on this little iceberg. But it shows under the water here. That's what I make the point of. These icebergs, 9/10 of them are underwater, and they can be sticking out. So you got to be really careful when you're sailing down here. And this shows you the size of large icebergs. This is far, far bigger than Cook's ship. This was kind of cute. The penguins were up here as our ship came by. They all ran down to the other end. And this shows some of the ice fields. And he would be sailing through this ice if he could find a way, a waterway through here. He had to be very, very careful, however, because if he got in here pretty far, let's say this is a clear path, somewhat clear path in here, and the weather changes, then this can all freeze over. So what will happen is, here's a ship that's, this of course much later because they could take a photograph, but here's a ship that got frozen in. And once you get frozen in, you generally get crushed. So here's the ship getting crushed. And there would have been no one to know where he was or perform any kind of rescue. It would have been certain death. This is a picture, I really took it for fog. This happens to be Elephant Island now. This is famous for Shackleton. Shackleton's guys were in a crushed ship. They got over here to Elephant Island, which is off the Antarctic Peninsula, and they were actually on a beach down here to the left. And there's not many beaches. I mean, it was very narrow beach, like 20 feet wide or something like that. But I show this for the fog, okay? When this fog comes down to the ocean level, it's a whiteout. You can absolutely not see anything at all. And so this is what happened to Cook and the other ship, Adventure. They were in whiteout conditions. They tried to stay in touch by firing cannons, but they just, you know, it was just too difficult. So he's on his own for the second sweep down to Antarctica, and this is where he goes furthest. He goes to 71 degrees south. Nobody has ever gone below 60 degrees, period. He's gone 67 degrees and 71 degrees. And again, this is probably about 63 degrees up here, this tip of if he had been lucky enough to have chosen to go down over here, he would have been the first person to discover Antarctica. And one of the interesting things is they have to carry their food and water in, you know, they're in salt water, of course, so you can't drink salt water. And the icebergs are made of salt water, okay? And so they thought, well, you know, we can't really get water, but Cook said, let's try it. So they are out here, they're on an expedition, they're chopping some ice, and sure enough, when they melt it, it's fresh water. So there's a process that when it freezes, they actually get, the icebergs turn into fresh water. I do a little bit of, and I'm not going to go into it here, just a little bit on basic sailing to give the people some idea of what Cook had to do and what he was capable of doing with the ship and what he had to do to avoid icebergs. So this is just a simple illustration of tacking. And here is a replica of the ship. This happens to be the Endeavour, which was not the ship that he was using on this particular expedition, but it gives you an idea of a square rigger and some of the sails and what they can, and I explain what they can do. So the third sweep that he made to the south, at this point in time, his sails, his ships, they're leaking a little bit. The crews are really beat up. So he just didn't go as far south. Now, South Georgia Island had been discovered previously, so he wants to go there and then head south from South Georgia to see if he can discover anything new. And he does. At 59 degrees south, he discovers the South Sandwich Islands. So these are the furthest south pieces of land that anybody has ever discovered. So this is kind of what his 3 trips look like. So his third leg, he kind of went like that, and then he went back to England. Or here's, whoops, oh boy, let me go back to that.